Hey everyone, Ben here from Keep It Stupid Archery. This is my first video and today I'm going to show you the process that I use to build my traditional wood arrows. I'm not a professional arrow builder or archer, but the way that I build these arrows seems to work pretty well, so I want to share that with you guys. This is a completed one that I've already made and I'm going to take you through the whole process of how I do it. So this arrow shaft, it's a cedar shaft, 5/16 in size. I'm going to turn this into a pretty nice arrow. Not completely traditional arrow style, but it works. So this is what I do. What you're going to need are, firstly, arrow shafts that are the right spine for whatever bow you're shooting. I'm shooting a 40-pound Korean style longbow. So these 5/16 arrows, they're around about, I think they're around about 500 spine, and I'm going to bring it back to about a 400, 450 spine. I haven't checked, but they're around that, and that's sort of what works for me. And I'll show you the bare shaft tuning process that I use to get to the right length in this arrow. So this arrow at 32 inches is too weak for my bow. What I do is actually cut a little bit off the arrow as I bare shaft tune and work out what length the arrow needs to be to give me the right stiffness. So what you're going to need: arrow shafts, some glue on arrow points. I'm using 125 grain points. They're 5/16 in size, like everything that I use for these arrow builds. I use glue on nocks as well. You can actually cut a knock in the back of the arrow. I don't do that. I prefer to use plastic glue on nocks. So these are 5/16 as well. I've got 2.5 inch feathers, and the color combination I like to use is pink and blue. They're just really easy to find in the grass if you lose an arrow. So we're going to need 4 of those. So I use a 4 fletch configuration on these. You're also going to need some glue, a tapering tool that matches the diameter of your shaft. So this is a 5/16 tool, and on mine I've actually just, may not be able to see it on the video, but I've scratched in, it's backwards there, a P for my point taper and an N for my knock taper. The tapering tools don't come with any, this one doesn't anyway, it doesn't come with any marking to tell you which side is which, and I've made the mistake before of putting 2 point ends on my arrow. I'll explain that a bit more when we get to it. You're also going to need a fletching jig. I'm using a Boning Pro class. You can use any fletching jig as long as it's a clamp style jig. The other jig that I've got that I build my compound arrows with is a Boning Helix, I think it's called. It doesn't take these type of shafts, these type of feathers, sorry. So you need a clamp style one to actually get the feather in there. Leave that one for now. You're going to need something to measure your arrows with, so you know how much to cut off when we get to that. Of course, you're going to need something to cut the arrow with. And a few other things you might need are, I'm going to use all of these things myself. I use acetone just to prime my feathers and my shafts. Acetone may make them a little bit brittle and weak over time, but I'm usually going to lose or break my arrows before they get to that anyway. I seal my arrows with this is Scandinavian oil or Danish oil, just a furniture polish type oil will work. Whatever you like to use there. I also use a little bit of heat shrink tubing. This is 10 mil, works with 5/16 arrow. So I'll explain that when we get to it. And you're going to need a lighter to use the heat shrink. So, as I said, all of these are around, these are all 5/16. These shafts in Australia are around $5 to $7. They're cedar shafts, really nice. Feathers are around 50, 60 cents each. The nocks are around 50 cents and the points are around $1.50 each. So you can do the maths on that, how much it's going to cost to build your arrow. Taper tool about 15, 16 bucks, and the fletching jig I paid $50 for this one, second hand. They're around $100 I think. So you'll need those. Alright, let's get to the build. So I've already sanded this shaft. They're a little bit rough when you buy them, so I've sanded it down to make it nice and smooth. And I'm observing here, this shaft actually has, may not show up on the video, but it has some runouts. So that's where the wood grain actually finishes and kind of runs off. When you build your arrow, you want the runout to be going towards the front, towards the tip end. That's the stiffer sort of part of the spine. Usually you want the runouts to be pointing up. So if you're using a three fletch configuration, your index vein will be on the top with the runouts on the top of the shaft. I'm using a 4 fletch. It doesn't matter too much, and I'll show you a little bit of how I go through the process of knock tuning my arrows as well. So right up, what we're going to do is I'm going to do the point end first. Basically, taper tool is a big pencil sharpener. So we're going to taper that off. When you get to the end of the taper, as you can see, there's no more stock coming off the shaft because there's a little stopper here. So once it's there, nothing else will come off there. So now I'm going to take my glue and I'm going to put some glue right around the point of that arrow, like that. And I'm going to glue my tip on. So I take my 125 grain tip, and as I put it on, I'm going to rotate my arrow so that we get a nice amount of glue all around that shaft and the point. Now, if you've got something nice and hard, I'll just use my ruler here. I'm going to press this on. Might find it just gets a little bit more pressure in there and it'll be stuck on there really well. This is 10-second super glue, so this will be pretty well adhered there straight away. So that's that. My shafts that I'm shooting now are 29.5 inches. These shafts come out at 32 inches, which is way too long, and due to physics they're too weak in the spine for my bow. So I'm going to take my saw and I'm going to cut a full 2 inches off my arrow straight up. I'm just going to get off the edge of my table here. Oh no. Okay. So that run out there, actually, it's not the best idea for that to happen, but it'll be okay. Just going to cut that little run out off there. There we go. Normally you want a much cleaner cut than that, but it's not how this one went. Okay, so now I am going to taper my knock. Same thing. So knock taper, point taper are slightly different. I might have mentioned that. Right, tapering that off actually took care of that little run out. I'm going to sand that a little bit more. No problem. Excuse my sniffling, I've got a bit of hay fever. It's not COVID. Okay, so now my knock can actually just slot straight onto that point. Alright, so this arrow now, end to end on the shaft is 30 inches. I think this is actually going to be half an inch too long for my bow, but I'm going to go downstairs and shoot it at my target. I haven't glued this knock on, so when we shoot it and we'll see which way the knock actually ends up after the shot, that'll tell us if the shaft is too weak or too stiff. And if we find, hopefully we'll find that it's too weak, then we can shorten the arrow up a little bit, retaper it, put the knock back on, shoot it again, and that will tell us if the arrow is the right stiffness. So because I haven't glued this on, I can just take that off after I've shot it, cut it, retaper, put it back on. When I'm happy with the length, then I still actually won't glue this nock on until I've nock tuned the arrow with the fletchings on, but I'll explain that when we get to it. So I'm going to pause, go downstairs, we'll sling this arrow, and we'll continue on. Okay, I'm going to bare shaft this arrow now, and I'm going to show you which way the nock goes. I'm only going to be about 8 yards back. Okay, so it may not show up here on the video, and the video actually may be reversed, so this could look a little bit funny, but when I've shot this arrow, it has ended up with the nock to the left of the point down here. That indicates that the arrow is too weak, which is what I was pretty sure was going to happen. So now what we're going to do is shorten the arrow up by 1/2 inch. We'll retaper it, shoot it again, and hopefully it'll bring it more towards the center so that the arrow is hitting kind of more like that, nice and straight. If we find that the arrow actually starts to go nock to the right when we shoot, I'm a right-handed shooter. I don't know if this actually makes a difference for left-handed shooters or not, but if we find that the nock goes to the right when we shoot it, that may indicate that the shaft is too stiff. And guess what? We can't add more shaft back to the arrow after we've cut it down. So if we cut it too short, then that arrow is kind of wasted. So we're going to just go 1/2 inch at a time. You could even go just 1/4 inch at a time. But I'm going to head back upstairs and we'll continue the process. Okay, so now we'll take this nock off and shorten it up by 1/2 inch. So there we go. That's basically just the taper of the nock that's come off there. I love the smell of cedar, so I usually keep all of the shavings and everything and throw it in my fire pit. It's it's got a nice smell to it, so I really like that. Okay, so cut 1/2 inch off, nock back on there, we'll reshoot and see which way the nock ends up after the shot. We'll see if we've got an arrow that's now the correct stiffness, or it may still be a little bit too weak. So let's check it out. The arrow surprisingly hit in almost exactly the same spot. The nock was a little bit more towards the center, so I'm going to shoot it a couple more times. I think this is round about where we want it. Could even maybe take another 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch off. Okay, so when I put this knock back on, I didn't actually look at where the runouts were. I'm just going to twist the knock a little bit, making sure that the runouts in the wood grain are at the top. That may actually change how the arrow behaves a little bit. We'll see what it does. So, my point on target, I'm using a string walk when I shoot at that distance. That's string walking, something for another video. There's other guys that will explain it way better than I can. This arrow is hitting pretty much right where I point it. The knock is a little bit to the left, so it's still indicating that the shaft's a tiny bit weak. I think also the knock is rotating towards the right when it comes off the string, so that means that when we put our fletching on, we want a right wing or a right helical, right offset, whichever way we're going to do it. I know that there's this little mark on the knock here that I noticed, and I notice now that the knock is turned 90 degrees from where I shot it. So definitely getting some right rotation off the string with this. I've got a right helical fletching jig, so that's going to work out perfectly. But yeah, so this arrow is still indicating a tiny bit weak. I don't want to shorten it any more than where we're at though, because the feathers are going to correct most of that when we actually put those on there. The reason I bare shaft tune is so that the feathers don't have to correct the arrow too much in flight. If it's got a really natural, nice, straight flight without going to paper tuning, then that kind of indicates this arrow is going to fly pretty good when we've got some feathers on there. Cool? Okay, so we've got the arrow the right length. I'm happy with the spine stiffness. It's a little weak. I'm okay with that at this point. I know that they fly really good with my previous arrows at 29.5 inches, so that's what I'm going with. I'm just checking my fletching jig out now. These feathers are slightly longer than what I've used before. I think, measure it up. So yeah, I've used 2-inch arrow, 2-inch feathers before. These ones are a little longer. These are 3-inch feathers. So I've got to just adjust my fletching jig a little bit to make sure that they're getting contact all the way through. I'll spin it around, I'll talk you through that. So what I'm looking for, focus there, what I'm looking for is that when I put this feather in the clamp there, I've got a feather there, this is actually 2 inches. That black mark there is 2 inches from the bottom of the arrow right down deep in the taper down here. So I've put my arrow into the fletching jig. I always sort of start and finish my arrows in the same spot. I've got a little mark on my jig there so that I know which one to start with. The fletching jigs actually have numbers on them as well to let you know this, but I just mark it so that I can remember. Now the fletching jig has these little offset adjustments here. This arrow point magnetized to that. So this one at the bottom I'm pretty happy with. This one at the top I just moved a little bit so that my feather, when I magnet it onto this is just a dry setup, dry run. So when I magnet my feather onto my clamp, when I magnet my clamp onto the jig, I can see that the feather it's a little off there, but it has really good contact all the way down the shaft. And I'm not too worried about the helical or the offset. What I really want is just to make sure that that feather is touching the shaft the whole way along when I put the clamp onto the fletching jig. So I'm happy with that now. It's all set up. I've got a really good contact all the way along there, so I'll tighten that up there. And I'll show you the rest of the process that I use to get this all set. So I usually get a little clamp and clamp my fletching jig down to the table, so that one doesn't move. Yeah, pop that knock off because what I'm going to do is prep the shaft with a little bit of acetone. Not much. Just make sure there's no oil or anything like that off my hands and stuff when I've been handling the arrow, to make sure that my feather is going to stick down there nicely. So the reason I take the knock off is because acetone makes plastic really brittle. We don't want that with our knock. If I shoot this arrow well, it's going to last me a long time. So I don't want that knock to fail me there. Also, I'm going to do a little bit of acetone on just down each feather on that contact surface. Again, just to make sure that we get a really good, oh no, I just put acetone on the table. If you're doing this at home, put down some paper or something. Don't be a lunatic cowboy like me. Okay, so we've prepped all those shafts with a little bit of acetone. Let that dry. The shaft back in the jig. Now, I'm not endorsed by any of these companies that I'm using for this stuff, so if you see any branding or anything on it, I'm not endorsing that particular brand or that company or anything, but it's the stuff that I find works. So I'm using a Gorilla 10-second glue. It's impact resistant. That's why I use it on the point, because it's impact resistant glue. Makes sense. So I'm just going to put 3 or 4, let's do 4 drops of glue on to that feather. Now, the golden rule with gluing feathers and veins down is that less is more. So use the least amount of glue that you possibly can to get that to stick down to your shaft. Sit that cap on there and magnet down that feather onto the shaft. It's 10-second glue, so I'm going to hold it down for 10 seconds. I wasn't actually counting. That looks like it's long enough. Now, squeeze the clamp and take it off the feather, hopefully not disturbing the feather too much as we go. Now, turn the fletching jig to the next setting. I'm going to go with a blue feather for my next one, so I'm going to go pink, blue, pink, blue. Put it on in the same spot in my clamp, repeat the process. Remember, less is more. 4 dots of glue on there. And I should have mentioned this the first time, but I just used the cap, used the little nozzle on the glue to distribute all of that glue all the way along. Sometimes it pays to actually put a tiny little bit more glue on the leading edge of the feather as well, just to protect it when it hits the shelf. Glue this one down. A little bit too much glue on that one. Broke the rule. Broke the golden rule. Less is more. I used too much. On there, use cotton tip, Q-tip, whatever you guys call them. I'm in Australia, we call them cotton buds. In the States, they call them Q-tips. Hold a little bit of pressure on this vein again. I'm going to repeat this process 2 more times. So I'll leave you while I go through that process. Okay, so I've got my 4 veins now, my 4 feathers, I should say, on this arrow. Oh, my knock is still in the fletching jig. Slip that back on there. Okay, so now we've got our 4 veins on there. This is, as I said before, this is 10-second glue that I'm using. Usually I wouldn't shoot this arrow within about 24 hours of gluing the vanes on. I'd like to leave it on there, leave this to cure for about 24 hours, but I want to get this video finished, so I'm going to shoot this arrow today. We'll see what happens. I might lose a feather, but I'm happy to do that for you guys watching at home. I can get this fletching jig out of the way now. We'll continue on with the rest of the process. Now, where this arrow is up to right now, we've got a field point on there. We've bare shaft tuned. I know this arrow is a good stiffness. It's flying pretty good. Now we've got the feathers on there. You could say that this arrow is actually complete at this point. A lot of guys with their trad arrows will take serving string now and actually wind a little bit of serving string for about 1/2 inch along in front of the vanes, and then over that first little bit of the feathers. Some guys will even actually go and continue wrapping that serving string around all the way through and thread it in between these little gaps where the feathers open up like that, all the way down the back, and then serve a little bit at the back as well. I don't do that. It just probably takes a little bit too much time, I think, and I don't know if the benefit would be that much better. Right, so the next step that I take is I get a little bit of the heat shrink tubing that we got before. Now you can get this at some hardware stores, electrical wholesalers and stuff like that. I just got this from a hardware store. Like I said, it's 10 millimeter heat shrink. I don't know what that is in the US imperial measurements, but you guys can work it out. So I've cut, so maybe, let's have a look. I've cut a bit off there. That'd be like 2/3 of an inch, I think, and I'll slip that onto my arrow. Now, as I was saying, you could actually, as this arrow is right now, you could fire it. It'd be fine, it'd be a pretty good arrow, but there's a few little things that I like to do just to finish off my arrows. One of them is this, so heat shrink tubing on there, and I've slipped it up just onto the leading edge of the feathers. And that's going to protect them as they brush across the shelf, and it's going to protect them in flight. And if they come across anything, you know, if they hit some, if you have a misfire and you hit into some sticks or something like that, into the scrub, this will protect the feathers. So heat shrink's on there, lighter. I'm just gonna, oh man, that's cooked up really well. A bit black on there. Okay, so I've shrunk that down. What I haven't done is shrunk these little bits, so I don't want to burn these feathers. So what I'm going to do is hold that arrow like this, real carefully. Just going to get that ever so slightly close to the heat shrink in between. Heating that up and trying not to damage the feathers at all. When it's hot and it starts to shrink, I just press it down a little bit with my fingertip. I'll do that on all 4 of those little spaces there between the feathers. A bit more. Oh, come on, what's going on here? Okay, now it's going. Flatten that down. Press it down. Okay. Be careful not to burn yourself when you're doing this. Okay, good. That's that. Now I've got the lighter a little too close to the heat shrink and it's gone black on there. It doesn't really damage it at all. It's just how that's going to be. Okay, so I've got the heat shrink on there. Next step that I take with my arrow build is to take my Scandinavian oil or Danish oil or whatever. Oh, yeah. I'll give this a really good shake up. some paper towel, get a good amount on there. I'm just going to dress the entire shaft with some oil. I don't even know if it's oil, it's Scandinavian oil or Danish oil, or there's a few names for it. But I just give my shaft a really good go with that. I'm going to give it 2 goes because I like it. If you spill this on your table, unlike the acetone that I spilled on there before, you can just polish it in and it's quite good. Alright, now what I used to do when I got to this point was use a paintbrush and go in between the veins, but I found it doesn't actually make too much of a difference, so I'll just get it in there, brush it all in. This slightly waterproofs the shaft and gives it a little bit of protection for while we're out. If you're out hunting or anything like that, obviously this isn't a hunting arrow, it's got a field point glued on there. This will only ever shoot targets. If you want to make a hunting arrow, all you have to do is get the same size, the same grain weight point. This is a 125, so if I've got a 125 grain glue on broadhead that's 5/16, because that's the diameter that I'm using, glue that on, try and line it up. If you use it like a, for example, a 2-blade broadhead, line it up with 2 feathers at this end, just eyeball it, and then you can actually use that as a hunting arrow. I'm only shooting 40 psi, so I'm only shooting 40 pounds draw weight on my bow, so I'm not going to really probably bother hunting too much with that. I'll save that for my compound bow. Okay, so this arrow is basically complete now. So we've tapered both ends, we've glued the nock on, we've bare shafted it, got it the right length, we've got it the right spine stiffness, happy with all of that. Glued on the feathers, put a little heat shrink tubing on there to protect it, and I've dressed it with some Scandinavian oil. I usually like to give it 2 coats, so I wouldn't mind letting this dry and then giving it another coat of oil, but I'll do that later on. I'll finish off the video and show you guys how this thing shoots. The other thing that I'll explain now, the reason I haven't glued the nock on yet, is because what we can do is test this arrow against, see if it groups with my other previous arrow builds. And if I find that potentially I shoot maybe 3 arrows that I know are flying really well, I'll shoot those at the target and I'll see if this arrow groups with them. If it doesn't, if it groups off a different direction, what I can do with a 4-fletch configuration is turn my nock 90 degrees. So if I find that it's not grouping or not flying very well at this point, what I can do is just turn it to the next position. So I've got my, like the way the string runs through here is actually in between the feathers. So I've got 4 options there, so I can twist this, fire it again, check it. If I'm still not happy, I'll just rotate it to the next position. And we'll keep going until we find a spot where this arrow flies really nicely and groups really well with the other arrows. And then once I've done that, I can take this off, just like with the tip, run a little bit of glue around here, put that back on, and I would mark this to know which spot I actually want my nock to be in, because we know which one it's going to fly well in. And I'll press it on, get a little bit of pressure on there, and that nock will be on there and it'll be set, and this will be a really good arrow. So we can tell which one's which because these have a, I don't know what style cut that is, but these are round, and this one I think is a shield cut, so it's got a little bit out of there. So I'm going to go and test this against maybe 2 of my other arrows that I know are flying really nicely. If I'm happy with it, I'll glue the nock on, and that'll be that. I'll finish up the video just with me shooting this arrow now, and you know the rest. So anyway, this is my first video for Keep It Stupid Archery. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Leave me some comments. If you've got a better way to build arrows, definitely please let me know. I'd love to learn anything that anyone's got to offer as far as that goes. If you've got any questions, also just hit me in the comments below, and thanks for watching.